Today we're going to listen to a talk concerning environmental, social, and governance trends and best practices of mining, or ESG trends and best practices of mining. Mining companies that clearly outline and adhere to principled ESG standards agree to conduct themselves ethically in these three areas. Today's speaker is Katie Fedosenko, the Director for ESG Engagement for Teck Resources Limited. Katie has held progressively more senior roles concerning sustainability and external affairs since joining Teck 9 years ago. Teck is a Canadian mining company that operates 11 sites around the world, who intend to have net zero emissions by 2050 and be nature positive by 2030. Before joining Teck, Katie was a freelance writer and communication consultant who worked for environmental NGOs. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in English honors from UBC in British Columbia, Canada. Thank you for talking to us today, Katie. Take it away.
Colin, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining on this evening. I'm sure from all of your homes, given we've all been forced to stay home with the tube strike here in London. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. Colin mentioned I'm Katie Fedosenko, the Director of ESG Engagement with Teck. And I thought when it comes to talking about trends and best practice in ESG, we would use Teck as a bit of a case study. Today I'll talk about how there's a growing demand for critical minerals and metals, and how we're meeting that demand, hopefully responsibly. In particular, I want to walk through our approach to sustainability and do a deep dive on two of the most pressing ESG issues of our time, climate change and nature, which I think is particularly relevant given COP27 is happening as we speak. At the end, I'm hoping we can have a good discussion on what it means to do responsible resource development and how we can promote that around the world. Next slide, please. Colin kindly introduced you to who Teck is, but I thought for those who might not be as familiar, I'll start with laying the foundation of who we are, where we operate, and what we produce. Teck is a leading Canadian mining company with roots that go back over 100 years. We produce copper, zinc, and steelmaking coal, with operations in Canada, of course, the US, Chile, and Peru. And we have major development projects in Chile, Canada, Peru, and Mexico, and exploration sites worldwide, including Turkey and Ireland. Our focus is on providing materials that are critical for a growing modern world and the global transition to a low-carbon future, while ensuring that sustainability and responsible production are at the heart of everything that we do. Next slide, please. Teck is building a solid foundation to become an industry leader in copper growth. Our Carbonablanca Phase 2 project will have first production in the coming months, which is super exciting. And as we grow that copper business, it'll be equal to or greater than our steelmaking coal business. With this growth, we're well positioned to enable the ongoing transition to electrification and with that, decarbonization of the economy, while being one of the lowest carbon producers of copper in the world. In fact, it's our goal to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And we're working to reduce that in the short term by reducing our carbon intensity by 33% by 2030. Looking ahead, we have a pipeline of projects that would potentially add 5 times the amount of copper to our production, which will go a long way in terms of providing the copper that the world needs. Next slide, please. A big reason why Teck can advance projects as big as QB2 and grow our copper business is because of our proven track record in responsible mining. We're committed to the highest standards of safety and sustainability, and we know that's absolutely essential to be able to continue operating in communities, but also attracting the best people. I've had the lucky opportunity of hiring a number of people at Teck over the years, and the number one thing people say to me, the reason that they want to work at Teck is because of that commitment to sustainability, which is, I think, quite remarkable given there's many very high paying and excellent jobs in the mining industry. Core to that performance is how we govern and manage sustainability. It starts all the way up with our board of directors. We have a dedicated safety and sustainability committee that sets and monitors performance, creates policies, and provides strategic guidance. At the management level, there's a number of leaders and committees focused on material issues, supported by a dedicated team that I happen to be part of. In addition to our internal policies and standards, we're guided by international frameworks, many of whom are based here in the UK, including the ICMM, the International Council on Mining and Metals, pardon me, as well as the Mining Association of Canada and their Towards Sustainable Mining program, which I know has been adopted by different countries all around the world. Most recently, we're super proud to have had our first site certified to the copper mark. And for those of you that attended the LME recently, you will have seen there's a new zinc mark and moly mark, and we're looking to implement those certifications at our other operations around the world. We've been recognized for our performance and sustainability. We've been ranked #1 on the S&P Global Corporate Sustainability Assessment. I used to call that the DJSI, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. We've also been top ranked by ESG Performance ratings and rankings, Sustainalytics, Moody's ESG, and MSCI. But the thing about sustainability leadership is that expectations continue to evolve, and I think rightfully so. So while we're super proud of what we've accomplished, there's way more work to be done. And in fact, that's actually why we've recently established an office here in London, because we know that leadership in ESG and sustainability is really at the forefront here and in the rest of Europe. And so we want to listen and learn, identify those trends and best practice. I want to hear from you today at the end of our conversation to understand what I can bring back to Teck and ensure that we continue to meet those standards for sustainability for performance. Next slide, please. All of our work in ESG is underpinned by our sustainability strategy, which sets both short-term and long-term goals in the 8 areas of focus that you see on the slide. There's a lot of them. Sustainability is very complex, and the huge number of issues that are within ESG, the 8 that we have here, are very complicated to manage, and that's why we really set some long-term ambitions that we can rally around at our organizations. Ambitions like being a carbon neutral operator by 2050, eliminating serious injuries and fatalities, and working to implement innovative water treatment, both to protect water quality and water availability for communities. We update our strategy on a regular basis. We're actually heading into another cycle with our first strategy launched in 2010. We typically follow a 5-year cycle. And when needed, we will actually launch new goals in between cycles. You may have seen in the news that we recently released new Scope 2 and Scope 3 goals that I'll talk to later in our presentation. And we also made a recent commitment to be nature positive by 2030 that I'll share a little bit more about. Next slide, please. Central to our prioritization and reporting on ESGs is what's called materiality. For those that are unfamiliar, it's the process of looking at what's most important to your organization and what's most important to your stakeholders, and the intersection of those two issues really becomes the material ESG topics that you should focus on in your disclosure and ultimately in your strategy. And for Teck, those 3 big issues last year were health and safety, Indigenous peoples, and climate change. And I'm going to do a deep dive on climate and on nature, but before I do, I thought I'd just touch on health and safety and a couple of other ESG issues so we make sure we have good coverage when it comes to best practice and trends in ESG. Next slide, please. Health and safety is an incredibly important issue across the mining industry. We track health and safety metrics. For example, one of our most significant metrics that we track is high potential incidents, or people might think about it as near misses. Effectively, it's the injuries that haven't happened yet but could have led to a potentially fatal occurrence. This is important for us in comparison to lost time injuries, which we see as a lagging indicator. And it's really great to see that in the last year, we've actually reduced our high potential incidents by 38%, and we lowered our lost time disabling injury frequency by 11%. But very sadly, in January of last year, we had a fatality at our Red Dog operations in Alaska. And with all such incidents, we carried out an in-depth investigation. For those that are familiar with the term, we did an ICAM to identify the root causes. We've implemented measures to ensure that that never happens again. Next slide, please. A couple other issues before I deep dive. On human Indigenous rights, we had no human rights incidents last year. And what I think is really interesting is that we remained focused on implementing 85 active agreements with Indigenous peoples. And that could be a whole other webinar, working with Indigenous peoples and how important it is to make sure we have a common understanding of their shared objectives, and that we have clearly agreed upon terms within those various agreements. On water and tailings, we're working to manage water resources, protect water quality, and maintain water access where we operate. Last year, as we built QB2, we also built alongside it a desalination plant. You could imagine operations in Chile are incredibly water stressed, and so it's very important for us in terms of maintaining community support that we weren't impacting freshwater availability, and instead we're using desalinated seawater, which is treated at the port and then brought in for processed water to our operation. We also quadrupled water treatment at our steelmaking coal operations in the Elk Valley region of British Columbia. And when it comes to tailings, we're working to implement the new Global Industry Tailings Management Standard, or GISTM, especially after the tragedies that happened at San Marco, Mount Poly, and Brumadinho. You can actually take a look today at our annual facility reports that are available on our website. And a lot of what GISTM does in terms of looking to promote transparency is make sure that's a consistent practice across the board for the industry. The last two topics I'll quickly touch on before we get into climate is on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and on technology. We consciously work to create an environment that respects and values diversity of the people and the communities around us. And last year, we had a special focus on diversity of gender in the workforce. 1 in 3 women hired at Teck last year were women, which I think is super exciting. And while our workforce was only 21% women, that's significantly higher than the industry average of 15.7. On innovation and technology, there's a really interesting program that I actually had a chance to be part of last year called RACE. It's our transformation and technology program, and all the work that we do here in sustainability is benefiting from that new technology, machine learning, advanced analytics, automation. We're using all those technologies to help improve health and safety, our water management, our tailings management, at the same time as reducing costs. The RACE program actually achieved $1 billion in annualized savings thanks to those technologies. And it's really exciting to see how we're starting to use them to improve our ESG and sustainability performance as well. Next slide, please. All right, on to our first deep dive topic, and a good opportunity for me to have a sip of water. Next slide, please. So when we think about the portfolio of future essential resources, it sounds a bit jargony, but I think it's really interesting to kind of turn the idea of energy transition on its head. Most people, when you think about energy transition, think that it'll actually require less resource extraction, like mining, but it's actually the complete opposite. The additional demand driven by the low carbon transition, on top of growth driven by demographic shifts, will create unprecedented demand for critical minerals and metals. On the demographic side, let's just break that down. They say that by 2045, there'll be another 2 billion people around the world living in urban centers. Close to 90% of that increase will come in Asia and Africa. When you think about what that means, it's the equivalent of building a city the size of London every month and a half for the next 23 years. That's going to take a lot of metals and minerals. And one of the ones that'll need the most, of course, will be copper. Copper is an essential component in renewable power generation, energy transmission, and of course in electronics and green technologies. A recent S&P Global study, which I'm sure many of you have seen about the future of copper, looked at that rising demand and looked at the energy transition. And it said that by 2035, there'll be a global shortfall of 9.9 million tons of copper. Here's another dynamic fact for you. To put that in perspective, Teck is currently building QB2, as we talked about. Once it ramps up to full production, it'll be one of the top 15 copper producers in the world. It'll take over 30 new QB2s to close that supply gap. And by 2050, we'll anticipate demand for copper will grow by 2.3 times, with zinc and steelmaking coal growing alongside it. Next slide, please. The key challenge facing us in the mining industry is meeting that demand responsibly. And a major part of doing that, in addition to all the other ESG topics we just covered, is producing more product with fewer emissions. At Teck, we have a solid starting point. We're very lucky that in Canada in particular, we enjoy an abundance of hydroelectricity, which is very low carbon or no carbon at all. So to start, as you look at these graphs, what you see here is the intensity of our direct emissions, our scope 1 emissions, or indirect emissions known as scope 2, for our major products is in the first or second quartile for the industry. In addition, the majority of our business is already covered by carbon pricing. So unlike many of our peers, the cost of carbon's already factored into our cost structure. Next slide, please. So we have low carbon operations, which is good news. And we think that we're producing the right metals that the world needs for the low carbon transition and these growing demographic shifts. But there's a lot more work to do when it comes to actually reducing our own operational footprint and supporting emissions reduction in our value chain. Another big reason, by the way, that we're here in London is to engage with the financial community. And I can tell you that the number one issue that they ask us about is our own carbon footprint and what's happening downstream with scope 3. As I mentioned earlier, it's our goal to be net zero by 2050, and that includes both scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. We have our short-term goal of reducing carbon intensity by 33% by 2030, but we also have a really exciting goal on being net zero for scope 2 by 2025. And there'll actually be a really exciting announcement about that shortly that I'd be happy to share with all of you soon. We're also working with our steelmaking customers and transportation providers to reduce our downstream emissions. And what's really interesting about work in climate, and this is another question that investors ask us, how do we actually govern it? And what I can tell you is that our board of directors and our management team are very much involved in assessing climate-related risk and opportunities. And climate change performance is actually integrated into our executive compensation. Next slide, please. A recent change within Teck, I mentioned that we have a dedicated sustainability team. And when we thought about the amount of work ahead of us, we actually decided to create a dedicated decarbonization team, which is led by our new Vice President Decarbonization, who reports directly to the CEO and our President and Chief Operating Officer. She leads the team to implement a strategy for decarbonization technology, and I thought to make sense of that, I'd explain our highest emission sources as a bit of a case study. Our largest source of scope 1 emissions is fuel consumed by our mobile fleet, probably no surprise, and 70% of that comes from haul trucks. For scope 2, it's primarily electricity that we use for Carmen de Andacollo and Quebrada Blanca operations in Chile, because electricity in Chile typically has a higher amount from fossil fuels. And for scope 3, it's all about the transportation and use of our products. No surprise there, we produce steelmaking coal. It's very carbon intensive. To reduce all those emissions, we're focusing on 4 key areas. The first is to source clean electricity from our operations, and that's the announcement I told you to watch out for maybe later this week. The second is electrifying our fleet and our equipment, prioritizing our highest emitting source first, which, as I mentioned, is our haul trucks. Third is utilizing new technology to reduce our stationary combustion, like our coal dryers, and carbon capture utilization and storage at our Trail smelter in BC. And fourth, we're reducing GHG emissions in our value chain, both through low emission supply chain corridors and working with our customers and transportation providers. Next slide, please. I'm happy to say that we're making some good progress in our decarbonization journey. For our nearest short-term goal of being net zero scope 2 by 2025, we currently source 100% of renewable energy for Carmen de Andacollo and 50% for QB2. And I had a chance a few years ago to visit the solar field and a solar that supplies power to QB2. It's some of the highest intensity solar in the world, and it was absolutely incredible to see it happening. For our 2030 goal of reducing carbon intensity by 33%, we're working to decarbonize our operational footprint. Earlier this year, we signed an agreement with Caterpillar to bring 30 new zero-emissions haul trucks to our sites in the next few years. We piloted the first electric transport truck, so a truck that transports our concentrate, at Highland Valley Copper in BC. We're improving traceability through certifications, new technologies, and transparency through our climate change report, which is aligned with the TCFD. We also recently issued a $4 billion US sustainability financing facility. I'm used to calling it a sustainability link loan, effectively a bond that includes climate change goals. Last but not least, we're working with Oldendorf Carriers, who transports our products, for them to use more energy efficient bulk carriers and reduce emissions by 45,000 tons. Next slide, please. Moving now to our second deep dive topic. This time, all about our approach to being what we call nature positive. Next slide, please. Nature loss is a severe global challenge, which is intimately connected to climate change. Global biodiversity decreased by 68% in the last several decades, and it's estimated that 20% of all species will be extinct in the decades to come. We believe that we all have a part in halting and reversing that trend. As a resource company, we want to do more than just mitigate our own impacts. We want to contribute to solving that global challenge, and that's why we announced that we have a commitment to be nature positive by 2030. Next slide, please. But what does nature positive really mean? It means that, as demonstrated in this graphic, for every 1 hectare of land that we disturb, we'll rehabilitate at least 3. And if we achieve this ambition, our conservation, protection, and restoration of land and biodiversity by 2030 will exceed the disturbance caused by our mining activities using a 2020 baseline. And what I think is really exciting here is that for a number of years, Teck has had a commitment to be what was called net positive impact. And that meant that we would return mining lands to their original form at the end of mine life. But a big part of Teck's strategy is having long life assets in stable geopolitical jurisdictions. So in many circumstances, our mines won't close for 10, 20, 30 years. But we know nature loss is a problem today, a challenge that we have to step up and help to solve. And that's why we wanted to take that 2020 baseline and start taking action. So how will we do it? If you can go to the next slide, please, Mike. Importantly, we'll partner with communities and Indigenous peoples to conserve ecologically and culturally significant lands. We'll incorporate nature into decision-making across the mine lifecycle and value chain. We'll pursue rehabilitation excellence, and we'll work to conserve, protect, and restore both in the areas we operate, but also at sites around the world. And hopefully that'll include here in the UK. We're working on a few different partnerships right now, and if you know any, please let us know. Next slide, please. What was really important for us when we launched our commitment to be nature positive was not only to make the commitment, but to demonstrate that we were taking action. So at the same time, when we launched our commitment in June, we also announced new initiatives to protect over 14,000 hectares of land. We purchased and actively maintain nearly 8,000 hectares of land in the East Kootenay region of British Columbia with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and we donated just over 160 hectares of Teck-owned land to the Wycliffe Wildlife Corridor near Kimberley, which happens to be also the home of our former Sullivan mine. Our work to be nature positive extends to our operations in South America, as you can see pictured on the slide. For example, we're protecting nearly 6,000 hectares, and you'll have to pardon my terrible Spanish, of the Salar de Alcancha, or the Alcancha Salt Flat near QB2. It's a unique high-valued wetland ecosystem, which will be protected in partnership with the Oyahwe Quechua community. It's the initiative is actually the first of its kind in Chile, which is pretty remarkable. In total, we've committed nearly $25 million to being nature positive. And importantly, this includes a $10 million Indigenous Stewardship Fund that will support communities and partners in developing Indigenous-focused environmental stewardship initiatives. Next slide, please. Well, that brings me to the end of my talk. It's been absolutely my pleasure to share with you a little bit about Teck and to do a deep dive on our 2 biggest priorities, which is to be, of course, having zero emissions by 2050 and be nature positive by 2030. It was really exciting to talk about both those trends and best practices, and I hope we'll inspire some really interesting conversation and discussion today. With that, thank you very much for your time, and I welcome your questions.